All right, awesome. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna get everybody energized up, I guess. Hi. Uh, yeah, so this has been a really great set of keynotes to lead up to my talk. Uh, Really incredible group of people. I love hearing all of the different perspectives that we get to hear from different parts of the community. So you've heard bits and pieces of my talk in the earlier talks. So I'll try and move along if I end up covering things that other people have already covered. I think Ashley did a really incredible job of touching and introducing what we need to do to start addressing what I'm going to be talking about as well. And Node Together is a really awesome approach to that. So that was I'm really lucky to be part of that lineup. So we're here today to share some stories and also some meaningful thought on the story of community that drives Node. Where we are, where we've been, and where we're really excited to go. But to get there, it takes a lot more awesome people. And that's not only coming to the project, but staying. In the Node project and open source in general, we ask of total strangers to come and collaborate on a project that we all benefit from. In order for them to feel welcomed and stick around, they should feel like they belong. To create that sense of welcome, barriers to access and biases need to be surfaced. People must feel safe enough to contribute. An inclusive open source community will result in better code from a more diverse range of developers. We're making up for a lot of lost time due to these systemic failures and biases that have happened for generations. In order to actualize that change, it should be reflected and represented at every level of leadership in Node. So we lead by example. That means finding champions within the board, within leadership of the working groups, and within role models in the community at large, in the ecosystem. So what I want to talk about is how every person in the community can contribute to this. They already can, but they also need to feel that sense of ownership and agency to do so, and hopefully be able to see a path forward. I do want you to prepare yourself. You're likely going to find yourself at some point during this talk feeling a little tight-chested. I know I do right now. A little hot in the cheeks, a little kerfuffled. That's okay. I am not right all the time, although I would like to think so. But that's why I ask for a lot of input. And within these discussions, we often feel ourselves having extreme emotional reactions to things that are being said. And those moments are also the moments that we can learn the most from. So I'm going to ask you to embrace that a little more here today, and more so moving forward. So let's take a deep breath and be kind, receptive to maybe to this talk and also what we've heard today. Because I really want your insight. Other people in the project want your insight if you're not already contributing. And that's a really difficult thing to present here on stage. So thanks to everyone that's done that so far and who will be doing it. So what does diversity and inclusivity have to do with the health of a growing global open source project? I know some people, this might be preaching to the choir, but I like to make sure that people know this because I don't like to assume that anybody does. So inclusivity, as Ashley had also covered, means feeling supported, heard, wanted, and needed. In our context, it's also the intention and policy, so official representation, saying that people should be included who are otherwise could be excluded or marginalized to create a productive work climate of trust and respect. So we're working together towards the common goal, which is Node. Diversity means background. It means diversity of thought and perspective. And that's for everyone who wants to take part or may not yet, but should feel so at any time, and not because they aren't be driven away by not feeling included. So why do we value this? It's about creating opportunities for everyone. Diversity and inclusion brings us all opportunities to learn and grow from one another. So it's not just the people we want to include so that they can learn. It's self-serving. You will also learn. We will all learn. We all become better with more diverse views when we are able to listen and learn. So, talk about a worthy investment with a great return, if we want to have that angle. It's good for the health of the project. Diversity of thought improves project outcomes. That's in companies, that's in products, that's in open source projects. And we'll get left behind. There's plenty of organizations that are doing a good job, that are actively being present and deliberate in the work that they're doing, and we shouldn't lose contributors to our project because they don't feel welcome. That's silly. So next, I'm going to talk about where we've been. So Node, and I'm sure this has been covered, but just to remind you, Node is 7 years old now. So yesterday was the anniversary of the release of Node version 4.0, which combined both the Node project and the IO project into a single code base under the direction of the Node Foundation. So back in 2009, Ryan Dahl started a really cool project to do IO a little differently. A little further in, it was debuted to the larger JavaScript community at JSConf EU. So it turned into this, this small group of folks who were really nerding out on a really neat project, and it started turning into a bigger global group of folks. The first NodeConf community conference happened, filled with a lot of new discoveries and smaller burgeoning communities coming together and really getting us, to discover different ways that we could use this new thing. How many people have been able to make lights blink thanks to Node bots? It's really cool. And I know that was one of my first experiences in Node. Eventually, Joyent ended up stepping up as the corporate steward of Node. We ended up seeing larger traction in communities such as Node School, which started in 2013. Again, NodeBots helped grow. We've seen Node Together, pulling in these really awesome communities that you may not even experience on a regular basis, but they're there and they're doing really awesome, positive work. So in most of these moments in our history so far, and when I say history, it's community, because we've got some really awesome experts here who can speak more to the code side of things. There were a lot of small groups in this history so far. You have the contributors, it was pretty small, especially when you're talking about core. The steward, and BDFLs, which is benevolent dictators for life, which don't end up being for life, but we use that term anyway. And sort of making the most of the decisions as Node matured in commits. So there was a massive pile of work to be done, and not so many people working on it. And as an individual as individual developers and companies adopted the technology, we were really lucky to get more people actively trying to improve the code base. The community investments, however, focus very much on a decentralized, whatever you can and want to do, just run with it. So it led to a really incredible space where if a person could dream it, write a little Node code, and make some friends to help with said dream, you would make it happen. This eventually also gets us into a bit of a pickle with growing as the platform matures. There's little to no explicit leadership, which at one point was not necessarily a bad thing. But that also means that there's no driving forces for values. And again, early on, when the community, or what that word even means, is being codified, you don't want individuals who are driving that. You want it to be from the ground up and the community building that together. But that sort of brings me to the next point, which is, have you ever heard of the idea of the tyranny of structurelessness? The tyranny of structurelessness is a really interesting 6-page essay that was a fairly strong reaction to the idea of the rigidity of structure. So that is generally the idea that groups are working on something, and they're working on something. Like, they really want things to get done. It can be in communities such as like political communities. It can be in your neighborhood. It can be a tech community. But this group has a common goal. And a lack of heavy organization and process early on was pretty integral to Node code and community events happening. The downside to that, though, is that as the platform matures again, that lack of structure can end up slowing things down or discouraging people who are really excited to help but do need resources. So I highly recommend checking out the Tyranny of Structurelessness. So a little about how the place was, the place Node was in leading up to the fork. So it was awesome for growth in the code base and working towards stabilization. I do want to say that when you see these screens, I do want you to pay attention to the disclaimer on the bottom right corner. We have some really awesome historians in our community. I am probably not one of them, and I'm looking forward to input on these afterwards. So thank you. Just make sure that it is kind. And so it worked. Like, early on, this lack of process, this lack of structure worked. But by allowing ourselves to deny official leaders really in any capacity, you end up getting de facto leaders who end up driving every portion of your community. And that can include whether you're paying attention to retention, which is a very official word, but it's like whether people want to stay or go try another language. So you've got, feeling welcome, the de facto leaders, and whether they, if they tend to be the most active people in GitHub, the people who are sitting on the sidelines, eating popcorn and watching the comments roll down, they are absolutely judging the experience of the community based on those things. And those are people who have potentially never contributed, or they've contributed in the past and they didn't feel really welcome, or they are currently contributing and they're on the edge. So collaboration is a skill. So is dealing with people. That doesn't mean you can't learn to get better at it, and I highly recommend it because it's good for your career as well as your spirit. And I like to say it's good for getting along with your coworkers. Most of us need jobs. And it turns out that anybody who's working with someone else in open source, it is working. Even if it's something that you enjoy doing in your spare time, you are collaborating. So maybe consider that the people that you're communicating with, you should communicate to them like you would a coworker. Like, would you get fired for something that you just said to them on GitHub? Would you be pulled into an office because your coworker is really tired of being treated like that on a daily basis? That sort of thing. Oh yeah, I should explain this a little bit. These are really goofy illustrations. And I had some fun with Rod trying to talk about like how you explain these, because you'll see how complicated they get really quickly. So I've got the dashes around here, which just, to me, it was a way to communicate that this is Node under Joyent. So this isn't Node from the very beginning. This is Node as Joyent was the corporate steward. So the dots that are sort of approaching the edges, I guess I can use this guy. These things are all companies. So you've got companies who were allowing their employees or hiring an employee to work on core. You've got companies who are sort of like half in the ecosystem. They use things other than Node, but they're trying to figure out how to be invested. Joyent was very invested, right? And these are a lot of the smaller companies. So I should have had lots of dots on the outside too, because there's tons of people not using Node. It's fine. And here what we've got, which again, probably inaccurate, you've got Node during the fork. And so we've got Node with Joyent over here, companies just doing their thing. They just want to write Node. They don't really want to know anything about our community conflicts. And then we've got I/O over here, which is like, you've got a lot of activity starting to happen over here. So you've got people who were contributing to core who are helping build I/O.js. You end up getting these cool things that are happening with working groups. So now more people, really all of a sudden you're seeing a lot more people feeling agency to get to contribute. And that's really exciting. But so much of where our negative experiences that have occurred have been communicating, or communication problems in general. We can't underestimate how vital other humans are and the need for them to know what's going on. If we don't give folks time to process, preparation via communication at any means, when someone finally does discover the information, they are getting surprised. Lots of people don't like surprises. They don't absorb them well. So we had the fork. The fork didn't happen because people didn't get along. There were people who were contributing, again, to both. So there were a lot of processes that we had set up, and I'm using the royal we here, so bear with me, to try and help ensure a high-quality code base. It turns out that we're always learning, and processes can get in the way. So they can also be changed by folks proving to test out the new processes, which was sort of the MO of I/O. Which was pretty cool. So that's where we were. Now I want to talk about where we are. So we have the Kira-meter. And the Kira-meter to me is sort of a reflection of community capacity. So there's this idea that our ability, or stalled ability, to get things done as individuals working towards this larger goal is what community capacity is. So we have to be able to promote or sustain the well-being of the community and its components, and that includes individuals, that includes informal groups, organizations as a whole, social interactions, the physical environment. All of these things are really important to someone being able to feel like they are able to contribute, have ways that they can see that they can contribute, and then have the time to do it. So that ends up, being sort of like, in a way, what well-functioning communities are, is their ability to have that capacity. So capacity development is a process of change, and hence is also about managing transformations, which we are really trying to do here. So people's capacities and institutional capacity and society's capacity change over time. And a focus on what development policies and investments work best to strengthen the abilities, network skills, and knowledge base cannot be a one-off intervention. So what is our community capacity? This is something that I've spent a lot of my recent time considering, because when you think about what the community capacity is or isn't, then you have to figure out the next step is how do we fix that? Because I don't want to find out our community capacity isn't great and then just sit on it. So there you go. The Kira-meter is in a very interesting place right now. So we keep seeing ourselves hit walls in Node, and I mean that in the community sense. The way I like to look at walls is two ways. I can argue with a brick wall, which I have been known to do, or I can try to break through it. And we can do that. It takes longer to break through, and it is much more work, but I at least have the opportunity to get somewhere by trying. So there you go. I think the fork represented a lot of heart. The conflict was an incredibly trying time for the future of the platform, but conflict is also healthy if it is a means to a solution. We ended up with a healthier code project. So sort of talking about where we are now, it's very complicated, right? So this is also super inaccurate, and this was the one that Rod and I were laughing about a lot. So I like to show this just to show how complicated it is. So this is not the, I'd love input afterwards so that we can have a form that's publishable. Yeah, so we have all of these groups that are working together And I don't really like the ends of these circles existing just because that's not really, there's a lot of blurry lines here of people who, don't even want to say necessarily they're not like identifying with the Node community, but they're absolutely a part of it. So you have, all the working groups with the CTC and TSC helping to oversee the project, and we've got the board of the Node Foundation and the Linux Foundation helping us out, and you've got the execs, which should really be much tinier because it's just me and Michael. And so this is really just like looking at this. I'm showing you all of this lead up is to talk about how complicated it is for a project to exist. But that also, as part of all of this process, this is how complicated it had to get, we think, right? In order to help grow Node, to stabilize it, to look towards the future of a healthy project. But like, what does that mean? That's when people ask about what the Node Foundation is, this is a lot. This is a lot of people, but it's also small groups of people. And what are we all trying to do? So now is the time to recognize the awesome and make them feel that sense of agency. But we also have to start giving a lot of thanks to people and make sure to do something like setting up a system to give thanks publicly and watch a new phase of growth take place. But all of that cannot happen without fixing inclusivity and diversity in the programming language community. So, yeah. What are we trying to do? In order to improve, we have to admit faults, not just the faults of what we have taken responsibility for in the past, but also for the larger world around us, which, we want to make better. So as Ashley said, the tech community has a major diversity and inclusivity problem. Those are two different things, but have to go hand in hand. And Node especially does, right? So what I want to talk about is how we can fix that. So we hear often there are a lot of problems. Node has a lot of problems with making people feel included, and certainly has a problem with diversity. But that doesn't mean we can't fix it. But like it also means you can't ignore that like we're not great. We're not doing a great job. So there are a ton of steps we can take here, and the first is to have goals, and that's measurable goals. So the idea here is that it's sort of the classic like project manager thing, where like when we look towards the future, and I want to say like whether I failed at something or not, I got to lay the lines first. So we got to know like how many people are in the Node community overall. That's a hard thing to say. We're a really awesome global group of people, and it's hard to even connect to everyone. So that was something, with the Node Live events that we've discovered. Traveling the world, we have not been as connected as we need to be, and that's awesome that we've been able to have that opportunity. We need to go further with it. So we'll have to look to that moving forwards of having these measurable goals, having ways to say like, okay, great, we have, 5% of all Node community people, not just core contributors, are from underrepresented groups. I don't know that number. We don't have that number. But what I'm saying is like we know it's going to be a low number, and I want to see it grow. I also want to see it grow over time. So a community thrives on the diversity of its population. It's clear from scientific research that diverse groups of people outperform homogeneous teams. As I said before, project outcomes are improved when differences in communication styles are properly managed. Common challenges unite us, but without access to the ideas and experiences of a wide range of people, the promise of communal solutions will continue to elude us. So now's the time. It was a luxury for us to be able to not address the problems that other communities and companies in tech had been facing. People wanted the platform and could turn the other way early on because they wanted the project to happen. Establishing the platform is where the energy was being funneled. But so how do we even measure that? We have a place to start, to know where we're going. Publishing, something like, you've seen all these companies do these like diversity projects, and unfortunately, it's unfortunate for them because they get reamed for it the next year. But they release their reports, and the numbers still don't look great. it's really hard to hire, there's a number of reasons why, to hire diverse, underrepresented groups in technology. And I can talk to you about that plenty more off this stage. But also being short-sighted about it. Like if you're publishing on a yearly basis, you're talking about large social and cultural change. So it also takes way more community members feeling a sense of agency. Remember the idea of community capacity. So how do we encourage, educate, and be diplomats of the community working together in these places? So what we've done is sort of looking at the long-term outlook with short-term goals. We need to establish that. So the TSC, individuals in the community, the board and the executives are all looking at moving responsibilities of the Inclusivity Working Group, which we had heard about earlier. So what does that mean? Figuring out the conflict of interest issues, figuring out why the model that was applied to the Inclusivity Working Group didn't work, moving it out of that model so that we can address the changes quicker. That's the things that we're looking to do. So again, sometimes we have to look through the processes we created in the past to make sure that they're still helping us move forward. In this case, I think a lot of us agree that it's time for change. So can we recruit folks within the community groups to help us make this positive change? How do we help these communities feel a sense of responsibility for the larger system? Because it has to come from the community members themselves. You can't just have someone from on high coming and saying, like, that's not cool. Because if the rest of the community thinks that it's cool, it turns out the individuals who are upset about it, like, they're going to feel othered. That's a problem. So, what groups can we be looking at to sort of like address these issues? So we've got the TSC, the CTC, the working groups, online communities, things like IRC, GitHub. So you're talking about things like moderation, which in itself is a working group. IRC, surprisingly, the Node channel in IRC, has been, code of conduct and moderating it has been worked on for a really long time. And it surprises me how behaved people are in that. It's actually a place that people can go to get questions answered, albeit there's everyone asking lots of questions in there. It's nice to see that can happen, but then why isn't that happening on somewhere like GitHub? And like we don't, we're not really having a central presence on Slack. We can look at the Node Foundation individual members, the corporate members, to look and see how they would also like to do this. Really looking at examples of communities, things like Node Live and Node School and Node Bots and Node Together and Node Girls. We want to raise up people that are doing really awesome things and reflect on the contributions they've had to the community. We can do things like, suggested ideas or things like, coaching for people who are trying to run community events, such as like maybe make sure that the panel that you're going to see has, diversity of thought. Maybe not all the same company, maybe not from all the same background. That would be really nice. And not only nice, but maybe it should be a requirement. Helping to encourage new events to happen, especially around things like workshops to teach or help improve programming skills. Making sure that those spaces are safe spaces that encourage confidence and integration into the larger community, and that also teach folks, things like how to be an ally. The Linux Foundation does this for other projects. Things like My First PR Nights to help people contribute to open source. All of these things that are helping to embrace learning help forge bonds because everyone's kind of like let down their guard and their ego to learn, and that's a really nice way to get to build community. We can also do things like partner with programs such as Outreachy and try and get a more diverse look into core by helping find monetary and time committed mentors to help a mentee through that really awesome but difficult project. And ultimately also things like leadership docs within nodes so that we know how leaders are expected to behave and that they are being held accountable because the leaders set the bar. We also have things like increasing communication and continuing to be transparent because that's vital to growing trust, right? So in order for us to be able to build this environment that is supportive, we have to be better about communicating to the ecosystem as well as educate so that they expect and understand the values that we have as a community. Enlist community volunteers to attend and validate, provide feedback related to community efforts and projects. We want to provide opportunities for community members to learn about moderation, to give perspective, and to share feedback. You want to avoid the us versus them mentality and seek to discourage it in the community because we're all working together. Try and remove the you. And so, do other things like provide survey feedback opportunities so that we can actually hear without people having to feel like they're at their wits' end because they've had no other way to give input, that they aren't happy with the current state of things, and give them the opportunity to give you feedback, and if they don't have a solution, that's okay too. Sometimes people just need to vent. And other things like the weekly newsletter, which will be a really exciting opportunity that we've seen prior in our community, and that lets people know what's going on in parts of the ecosystem as well as taking ownership for some of the tough stuff that's going on. We also need documents on how to interact with the Node ecosystem, such as how the Node Foundation works, which you saw that delightful diagram. What's happening in the Node community? This is the Node community, sort of people stepping into it, seeing like, what the heck, are we like? Because people will read things in the news, and that's not necessarily like a great way to communicate what our values are. So, this is what we believe is how people interact in the community, our expectations. So we can also bring in experts. So we aren't experts in a lot of things, though we like to think so. I have training in conflict resolution and mediation, but that doesn't mean that I'm an expert in it. So I would say, help bring in people that do know what they're doing to let us know what we're doing is useful or not, and find out the blind spots so that we can provide things like training and education so that the leaders of the community can help disseminate and share this awesome, work that we need to do. And then you have that fun. And lastly, things like moderating the moderators. How do we, give the community a sense of urgency and responsibility for this? Let them own it. Things like community selected enforcing. This is an idea, this is not happening. So I would love to hear feedback on this. It's not happening yet. The idea of increasing trust and holding community members accountable is something that we have admitted we have floundered in. So an example of ways that communities have tried to solve this is a community police enforcement board. The idea is that a board comprised of community representatives of varying and dissenting views, how this is defined is not defined yet, of course, because we're not doing it necessarily. But they are elected by the community to decide matters of police officer accountability. So the same would be said about not police officers, but other people in the community. So when reports are found to have conflicts of interest, they're sent to the civilian community, which would be this board, for decisions regarding misconduct. Anything regarding moderation would need to be a separate proposal because moderation is a separate working group. But this is sort of the idea. So it turns out most people don't feel comfortable and supported if they don't know who they are reporting problems to. Part of the problem with moderation in Node now is that if you have a problem, you might end up reporting something to the moderation group, and the person in the moderation group is the person you're reporting about. It's not ideal, and not only not ideal, it's not acceptable. So these are all things that we need to work on. So lastly, communities and companies alike are looking at us for what we are going to do next. I'm hearing this day after day. I get pings, I get calls, I get emails, and they're all asking how we're going to move forward. They're excited about the project, they're excited about our community, but they want us to lead, and we're not doing that yet. So what I would like to say next is if you'd like to continue this conversation, we're going to be having a diversity and inclusivity roundtable happening after the break in one of the breakout sessions. And I would encourage you to attend and be a part of the dialogue. Thank you.